So I'm just going to talk about the relationship between dung beetles and greater horseshoe bats and the impact of certain wormers and why it's an issue. Here we go. So so the relationship between livestock and greater horseshoe bats has been already discussed by Roger, but I'll just kind of go over it a little bit more. So livestock obviously famously produce a lot of dung. And then the dung is actually a brilliant ecosystem in itself. It's not the most glamorous home, you could say, but in terms of the amount of food that it produces for other species higher up the food chain, it is really quite useful. So dung beetles and other dung fauna will be making good use of the dung, and then in turn bats and other species like different birds will also be eating the dung beetles. But there are certain things that take place that will interrupt this kind of food chain, and one of the ones that we're focusing on at the moment is the use of certain wormers, sort of the most famous one being Ivamectin. So wormers being sort of introduced into that system can render the dung sort of almost sterile, or greatly reduce the populations of the dung beetles that would otherwise inhabit it. And then that has a knock-on effect on the populations of bats and other animals that would be making use of that food resource. So dung beetles in the diet. So moving on from what Roger was saying about different dung beetles that are focused on by the greater horseshoe bat. So we know that Aphodius, the genus of Aphodius, so an Aphodius beetle shown here, the smaller one. This is an Aphodius rufipes, which is one of the main food sources for the bats, and geotroop species such as this one. This is an example of a geotroop genus. So they're known to be key for greater horseshoe bats at certain times of the year, and they do tend to have a preference for cowpats over other dung. And the reason for that is quite brilliant, because they like to have the juicy liquid bit of the dung as adults. So a cowpat is, as you probably all aware, a little bit sloppier than other sorts of dung. So sheep dung and horse dung, for example, usually can't actually host as many adults as cowpats can. So that's one of the main reasons why cattle grazing is actually the most beneficial. So when we're talking to farmers, we do like to sort of talk about dung beetles in of themselves as well. So we know that dung beetles are in decline. Over 40 species of dung beetles in the UK, and some fun facts about dung beetles as well, just to make people a bit more interested in them, is that they are thought to be the world's strongest animals. So one species of dung beetle can push the equivalent of 6 double-decker buses. So they're quite impressive creatures. They've got these very strong front legs for digging and burrowing. And then the next thing that's really great to be able to talk to farmers about is how dung beetles are thought to save the UK's cattle industry around £367 million a year, which is not a small amount of money. And the reason for this is to do with the burrowing activity of the dung beetles. They can pull down nutrients from the dung pats lower down into the soil profile. So they're creating more air spaces, more areas for water to percolate down. So that's having knock-on effects for things like drought resistance and compaction, and allows for more grass to grow. So they are really useful for livestock. So as I was saying, they are in decline, and some species are thought to have become extinct. The sorts of habitats that they tend to make use of are similar to the sorts of habitats that horseshoe bats make use of anyway. And so those habitats are also in decline. So, species-rich grassland, cattle graze pasture, those sorts of habitats that most of us are aware have declined in recent years. But probably one of the biggest kind of pressures on them is the use of wormers or anthelmintics in the livestock industry. So livestock are vulnerable to illness and death, just like our pets. We're often worming pets, and so we know the importance of being able to look after the welfare of livestock in the landscape. And so the use of these products has come about as a way to be able to counteract that. So there are unintended consequences as a result of that. So the type of wormer that seems to get the most attention when it comes to talking about the impact on dung beetles is the use of this particular class of wormer, which is Ivamectin. So Ivamectin is in the group of the Ivamectins. So all of these products that end in the sort of ending of ectin are quite sort of toxic really to dung beetles and other dung fauna. But it is the most popular livestock anthelmintic in Britain. It's very powerful, and it is kind of it's what's known as a broad spectrum product, so it can actually knock out external parasites as well as internal parasites quite quickly, and so it's favoured for farmers for ease of use. However, one of the issues with ivermectin, and one of the reasons why it's so problematic, along with the other sort of ivermectin products, is that a large percentage of it doesn't get metabolized at all by the animals that they're intended to be given to. So between 62 and 98% of that ivermectin product that is administered to the animal just gets sort of passed out unaffected into the landscape. So that's a very powerful insecticide being just dumped out, if you like, into the landscape at quite a high level, because it is very, very well used. So the focus has been on the use of ivermectins and avamectins, and they are probably the most harmful products that are in sort of widespread use. But there have been recent studies also showing the impacts of some of the other products as well. So, for example, a recent study by the RSPB in the Inner Hebrides showed quite adverse impacts of a product called Deltamethrin, which is used for the treatment of flies and ticks. And also another product called Triclobendazole, which is also really widespread, and it's one of the only products that can knock out the sort of early stages of liver fluke. And liver fluke is quite a widespread problem in the southwest, and a lot of these kind of warm, wet areas where we know are going to be really good for horseshoe bats foraging. And so this is quite it's quite a tricky issue to try and combat, because obviously we've got the issues of welfare for livestock to think about, but also trying to reduce the usage of these products where possible. And so a part of what we've been doing in the Greater Horseshoe Bat Project is looking at ways and how we can give advice to reduce the impacts of these products whilst not undermining the welfare needs of the livestock industry. So we've been using various different ways to try and get this message across. And when we first started on this is one of the handouts that we used quite a lot, which has been really useful. And this is a handout by Dr. Sarah Bainan from the Bug Farm in Wales. And so it's really easy and really visual. So you can see on the left-hand side, doramectin, ivermectin, epinomectin, and avamectin. So that those are all the mectins of the avamectin group of wormers, which are considered most toxic, and then heading off towards the right, which are less toxic. So we started off by handing this out and saying, think about the usage of what you're using, see if you can get advice on alternatives that are potentially less ecotoxic. But it does turn out that actually dispensers of these products, where you'll be picking these things up from, Mole Valley or other sort of veterinary practices, there's no requirement for them to advise on the subject of ecotoxicity, and very few studies are actually taking place to try and work out what the impacts are on insect populations before they're put to the market. So we've been trying to disseminate this as much as we can to the livestock farmers in and around the sustenance zones where we know that the impacts are going to be greatest. So how are we approaching this now? So what's been really interesting and actually quite encouraging is that in some of the, especially the farms around the South Devon Special Area of Conservation, farmers are aware of the impact of ivermectin. And there's also the acknowledgement that there's increased resistance to anthelmintics or wormers in the livestock industry, leading to a need to change the approach to worming. So just like with the sort of resistance to antibiotics, there's a resistance in the parasites building up to the use of these wormers. So they're having less and less impact. So there's an acknowledgement from all sides that the practices are changing, and they need to change further. But actually, if we're saying, please don't use ivermectin, what are we giving them as an alternative? Oops. So there have been various attempts in the project to try and address this. So one of them was spoken about by Donal Finch yesterday, And through his PhD, supported by the BAT project, he produced this really interesting article, really putting together all the information that we know about so far on the impacts of different products on the Aphodius genus of dung beetles. We've been running numerous workshops with farmers in and around the project areas. This workshop is where we are trying to teach farmers to use a kit to understand what the worm burden is in the animals in the first place. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So this is the fecal egg count kit that we are using here. I became trained up through a body called AMTRA to be able to be qualified to advise on the use of medicines for equines and also now for farm animals as well. This was quite a long undertaking, but it does mean that I am now sort of legally allowed to talk to farmers about their usage of wormers. So because it is quite a difficult topic, and if you're giving bad advice, then it can have bad consequences in terms of animals might die of worms, for example. So we need to be really careful that the advice that we're giving is appropriate wherever we can. So that's something that we've done in order to try it and approach it as carefully and sensibly as we can. So of the farmers that we have been talking to in the project, we have done a little questionnaire. And it's been quite encouraging, actually, the numbers who have said that they have made some changes to the way that they manage parasites on their farms. So 64% of the farmers that we asked said that they had made changes to make their worming practice more sustainable. 36% said no. There are various reasons for this, and sometimes it's because they were already aware of the issues and were already doing the right things. So there's a lot of interest in the farming community about better understanding this issue, partly because of the understanding about the resistance that's building up, so that they're aware that things have to change, and also it could potentially save a lot of money and in terms of the bills for buying a lot of these products, because they aren't cheap. So you know, we've got a lot of things in our favor to try and change some of the practices. So amongst other things, we have been focusing on ways to reduce the need for wormers. So we've been working with land managers, running these workshops and talking about dung beetles and the usage of wormers. And we've been doing that for landowners, but also for other advisors as well. So skilling up other advisors who are going out and talking to farmers on this topic. On our website, you can also find an interesting handout, which is all about parasite management in livestock and greater horseshoe bats. And that's available as a download and will be available after the project has finished as well. So that's quite a useful thing to have as legacy. For stewardship agreements, so through the project, we have been working very closely with farmers to put together agri-environment schemes. There is something for higher tier agri-environment schemes, which is called the Threatened Species Supplement. And with the help of Natural England, we've put together a package of recommendations that farmers can take forward and therefore be sort of compensated and paid to not use certain wormers in certain fields that we know are going to be used by horseshoe bats when they're foraging. So one of the most popular ways of trying to reduce the usage of wormers in general has been encouraging the use of something called fecal egg counts, which is a wonderful term. And this is basically helping farmers to understand how many worms are inside their livestock. So, and that is taking a small sample from the dung, putting it under a microscope and just counting the number of eggs. And that gives you a proxy as to how many worms are actually present and whether you need to worm at all. And so quite a few farmers have taken this up and are now using this on a regular basis in order to be able to better understand the needs of their livestock in order to know whether these wormers are needed in the first place. So that's been a really useful thing to be able to take forward. We've also purchased a lot of the kits for farmers to be able to do this themselves, because one of the issues and one of the barriers to being able to do this was that a farmer would collect a fecal egg count, a kit, send it off to a vet or a local merchant, and then they would have the results sent back. But that process takes a number of days and is quite expensive. So if you're wanting to do this, say if you've got an animal that looks a bit sick and you just want to know quite quickly if there's a problem, then this is the sort of thing that farmers can take forward in order to be able to better understand whether there is a need to use some of these products. So what can other advisors do? So we're hoping that from this project, a lot of people are a bit more aware about the need for thinking about this issue. So cattle grazing alone in the sustenance zones, it isn't necessarily going to help bats if the dung is sterile or doesn't have as many dung beetles as it should do. So certain practices that we would recommend would include things like encouraging livestock managers to treat their livestock only when they were indoors, so in a barn, keeping them housed for a few days after they have been administered some of these products, so that the dung, when it's first shed, is actually really has got the highest burden of these wormers. So keeping them indoors for about 2 days or so means that a lot of the product has left the system of the cattle before they're put back out onto the land, and therefore there's less impact on the dung beetles as a result. Using alternative classes of wormers wherever possible. So we know that ivermectins and the Ivamectin groups are possibly the worst. So using alternatives where possible is great. So there's a whole other group of wormers, for example, that are a lot gentler on dung beetle populations and metabolize better in the animals. And so if possible, we're trying to encourage farmers to use them. But there is also quite a lot of resistance issues to some of these products too. So it is a complicated field, and I think that's why it is such a problem. So we've been giving out lots of these fact sheets and running these workshops and helping farmers to skill up with the fecal accounting as well. So this is the final slide. So so we've been talking to farmers and a lot about this too, but Helen's been going out to schools and talking to school children about this the food chain as well. So this is quite a nice photo just to have as the end. So cows plus poo equals bugs and bats. So as long as there's not too much wormer going on in the system, that's a great message. And that's the end of the talk.